Hello, here we go with Understanding the American Promise, the Chapter 12 lecture, The New West and Free North. And basically, what we are talking about here is that America is expanding, and here you see a painting of war news with Mexico, or war news from Mexico, and that's just one part of this lecture. So one of the things the chapter talks about is the industrial evolution. So what factors contributed to America's industrial evolution? Well, number one, farm to factory. Millions of Americans during 1840 to 1860 moved from farms into the cities. That's called urbanization. Factory workers grew to about 20% of the labor force by 1860. In general, factory workers produced at least twice as much per unit of labor as agricultural workers. And we had a transition from water to steam power as a source of energy, thus raising productivity, especially in factories and transportation. And coal-fired steam engines powered more factories, railroads, and ships, and basically was cheap and easy to produce and replicate so that they could use coal-fired engines to create steam. Also, there was a concurrent rise in agricultural productivity. Agricultural spurred the nation's economic growth, nearly doubling between 1800 and 1860. And this is the most important factor, more than any other single factor. Other factors contributing to America's industrial evolution: cheap land. As farmers pushed westward in their quest for cheap land, they encountered the Midwest's comparatively treeless prairie. Rich prairie soils enticed migration by the thousands of folks to come into the Midwest. Labor-saving improvements in terms of farm implements also improved agricultural productivity, such as John Deere's steel plow or Cyrus McCormick's reaper. These inventions, I should say, multiplied America's agricultural productivity. Federal land policy also made cheap land available. The government was interested in purchasing land and then trying to populate that land with settlers. And the goal was to flood the lands with settlers, and so that eventually those settlements could then graduate into becoming states, which would increase America's hold on the continent. Other things contributing to America's industrial evolution was manufacturing and mechanization. Western expansion and government land policies improved agriculture, but because of this, workers in the factories were in shortage, and manufacturers were always trying to find ways to cope with that. The American system was all about interchangeable parts and unskilled workers. Manufacturing and then assembling interchangeable parts spread from gun making to other industries and became known as what's called the American system. Standardized parts produced by machine allowed manufacturers to employ unskilled workers who were much cheaper and more readily available than highly trained craftsmen. So what that meant is you could hire people to do very simple jobs, putting together parts, and they didn't have to be significantly highly trained. This led to a dynamic national economy. New England led the nation in manufacturing, shipping goods such as guns, clocks, plows, and axes west and south, while southern and western states sent commodities such as wheat, pork, whiskey, tobacco, and cotton north and east. So, in summary, out west we have an agricultural system that's buoying the national economy, and out east and north we have a factory system that is tremendous. Railroads also contributed to America's industrial evolution. The massive expansion of American railroads helped make us the second greatest industrial power to Great Britain in this time period. Railroads propelled the growth of industry. In addition to speeding transportation, they improved the industries such as iron and communications, and also stimulated the fledgling telegraph industry. By 1861, there were nearly 50,000 miles of telegraph wire working in conjunction with the railroad tracks. The ownership of railroads tended to be private corporations, whereas in other countries, such as Great Britain, the government owned the railroads. But privately owned American railroads received tremendous government aid, including federal land grants so that they could build. It's kind of like what's happening in California now with high-speed rail. It's going to be a private company, but the government is buying up land and helping out the industry. By 1869, you're going to have what's called the Transcontinental Railroad, which is going to link east and west, and that is going to really have the double effect of not only A, opening up the country and connecting it, but B, stimulating even more and more industry and making the American economy one whole. Here's a picture of the telegraph, and one thing about the telegraph, the railroad has a lot to do with telegraph and communication, because when you build a railroad track, it makes sense to put telegraph lines right next to that railroad track, because those are the best routes to get over land. And so those two inventions, I guess, the railroad and the telegraph, went hand in hand. Here's a picture of the many railroad networks that were built between 1840 and 1860. Notice how much more developed the northern states are than the slave states. And that's going to be eventually something that's going to be an advantage in the Civil War. Who benefited from all this growth? You would think everybody did. Well, sure, I guess. But let's see. Free labor. Free labor basically meant a social and economic ideal that accounted for both the successes and the shortcomings of the economy and society taking shape in the North and West. This is all about the characteristics of free labor are hard work, self-reliance, and independence. People that believed in free labor believed that a person could basically pull themselves up by their own bootstraps and work hard and become a player in this new national economy. So those are the characteristics. I will say that most Americans generally still believe this, that most people can become whatever they want to become only if they work really, really hard. A picture of a person pulling themselves up by their own bootstraps is shown here as an example of that free labor ideal. Well, you still had tremendous problems in terms of distribution of wealth, even though people wanted a free labor ideal. The average white man by 1860 made about $2,000, and most of them owned no land. About 60% owned no land, and 90% of free blacks were propertyless. What explained these inequalities? Well, free labor spokesmen considered these economic inequalities a natural outgrowth of freedom, the inevitable result of some individuals being more able and willing to work, and sometimes even luckier. Is this related to this concept called social Darwinism, where the market picks who is going to be successful and who is not? So, we all know that not everybody makes it in America, but sometimes people do. Social and geographic mobility also had something to do with this, as in search of better profits or prospects, roughly 2/3 of the rural population moved every decade, and population turnover in cities was even greater. This constant coming and going weakened community ties to neighbors and friends, and threw individuals even more on their own resources in times of trouble. What about immigrants? Did they benefit from America's economic growth? Well, we know that a lot of immigrants came to the United States between 1840 and 1860, comprising about 1/8 of the population, and about 4.5 million immigrants came. Many of them were Germans who came over as independent producers and skilled tradesmen. There were roughly about 1.4 million Germans who entered in these years, mostly settling in the Midwest. The Irish also, there were nearly 1.7 million of them between 1840 and 1860. Many of them were desperately poor and often weakened by hunger and disease. They usually congregated in northeastern cities, and roughly 3 out of 4 of them worked as laborers or domestic servants. So that's the economic part of the chapter. When we come back for lecture 2, we will talk about manifest destiny and the factors that spurred that.